taken some notes, and I'm going to see if I can turn these into some questions. I'll throw out a provocative opening for this group. Abortion and contraception are technological quick fixes. So is legislation against abortion. So are ecclesiastical rules against contraception. Both are technological quick fixes because they don't get at the cause of the problem. And if they don't get at the cause of the problem, they don't solve the problem. You can't solve the problem. It doesn't go away. That's a proposition. You can debate that if you want, but I'm going to connect it to the next piece. Oh, that was Rebecca's time. When we have 15 minutes, I have to set my time a because I think one of the things that you were getting at is that this is a multifactorial problem, right? And if we're going to solve it, we have to get to the real causes. I think Julie especially, you opened with this. These women were coming to the panel or the commission with real life stories and that experience was speaking to the commission. But even as we move forward, these issues of bodily integrity, why women are having abortions, right? We're not quite getting yet at the source. Charlie, I think, is getting closer to the source, or a source I would like to identify that nobody ever talks about. And in your conversation, you use all of these words, right? Marketplace, product, throwaway culture, blah, 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 blah. And I would argue that one thing that people don't really talk about is that one of the driving factors behind all the dynamics that you identified and the social need for abortion and contraception is the development of capitalism in the post-war period, driven by a kind of economics articulated by Milton Friedman, developed by the Chicago School, that exploded in neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s. And we have a very conservative Catholic culture, which is extraordinarily HV pro-life, but will never, ever criticize capitalism. We see that playing out in the reception of Laudate Si. We see this in all these other sorts of spaces. So how can we side with you, Charlie, in identifying all these dynamics that you talked about as problematic? Porn, sex robots, all this commodification on both sides, sex and reproduction, the economic problems driving women, without ever criticizing one of the real engines, the invisible hand engine behind this question. Go to.
That for me?
That's for all of you.
That's for all of you.
This is where you spar.
Well, I'll just start, but unless others want to. Okay. So Marco Rubio recently, both during the campaign and recently, has said he's interested in exploring the idea of some version of federally mandated paid family leave for women. Now here's a guy who is, in other contexts, radically implicated in what you just laid down as being a problem. So what is changing with him? What is going on with him? I think that's a very fascinating question. Maybe it's just trying to moderate to run against Trump in 2020, I don't know. But let's put the best spin on it possible and say that he's having some kind of shift here. I wonder if what's happening with someone like him, and not a few others are more on the right are more interested in talking about federally mandated paid family leave. I think what's happened is, and this gets to your first point as well, I think as they see the implications of what it will mean for women when prenatal children, in their view, are given legal protection, they're good people at heart, and they say, we have to do something to help women in desperate, difficult situations if we do this. And so for people whose primary value is defending basic human life, fundamentally vulnerable human life with equal protection of our laws, I think that has moved some of them to say, maybe my Milton Friedman, Atlas Shrugged type of approach to this is wrong, or at least needs nuance. Because I really care more about babies than I care about free markets. Now, there are some people who care more about free markets than babies, in fact, maybe a majority. But there are some who are, in fact, in my view, taking a hard look at what sorts of social supports would be necessary to really honor women and their bodily autonomy and their social autonomy and their economic freedom, vocational freedom, if we in fact do what we have to do if we care about equal justice for all people, which is, in my view, give prenatal children equal protection of our laws. So that's just quick kind of response.
Rebecca, I think, wants to add something.
If this thing works. Okay. I was thinking about this issue of market commodity as it pertains to human sexuality, both before and after the sexual revolution, because what you see is that the sexual revolution happened for reasons, some of them very good reasons, and I have no desire to dial back to before then, because before then you still have this issue of sex as commodity, reproduction as commodity, and fundamentally women as commodity. And I think that the capitalist libertarian model, which America is so infatuated with, is compounding this issue tremendously, but I think it goes back much further than that. In the formative texts of Western civilization, what we see is men fighting over women as property. That's the premise of the Iliad, and that's the premise of the great epic of the Old Testament of King David. And so I think we need to reevaluate not just our market economy, capitalist economy, this obsession with money and profit, but also how we regard women and just how rooted a patriarchal idea of women as property is in our civilization, and how much has that infected the Catholic tradition. How much has that kind of crept in on the margins of the gospel?
I agree, I think, with Charlie that you can't separate the question of capitalism from what's going on here in this document. I think we agree on that, and all the things that Charlie talked about having to do with reproduction. That's all true. And everything that we're seeing in terms of what's going on in hookup culture that is really coming out, and a whole discussion of what's now being called bad sex in addition to sexual violence. It's bad. Bad. I wonder, though, two things. One, does the market logic capture the reasoning of women who are getting abortions? So the kinds of stories that I was talking about, both from Guttmacher and from crisis pregnancy centers, don't capture women talking in terms of productivity in the market. They seem to be talking about relational responsibilities that they're trying to juggle and or that they're feeling pressured about. But they seem to be talking, at least using the language of relationship and not necessarily the language of the market. So I'm sure that language is out there, but I wonder if it captures all that's going on. And so is that necessarily the way to solve it? And the other question is, does that logic, if that logic is more salient in hookup culture, made possible, I would agree, by contraception, does that capture what's going on in the lives of married Christians who are using contraception? And that's where I'm not as certain. I don't think we necessarily have those stories. We have more of them from Protestants because they're allowed to talk about it. So we do have some of that, but there are very few narratives that I can even think of Catholic couples. There are a few, but not very many. But I would venture that if we were allowed to hear those stories, we would hear some stories of love and sharing and pleasure and power and intimacy made possible by contraception, in the same way that we also hear, I think also important to note, that we hear those beautiful stories in couples using NFP that we didn't hear when people were using rhythm, right? But there's a lot of good news about sex, I think, especially in the context of committed relationships and marriage, that maybe isn't captured by framing the conversation in terms of the market.
Right, and I think partly in response to some of your stuff, I was also thinking more on the unitive side of Humana Vitae, which we're not really talking about here, right? Though, well, I think on both sides, and again, it's multifactorial, right? This is just one, I think, big factor that people don't talk about, this engine that's driving it. But to practice a lot of these sort of NFP lifestyle practices requires that you be economically countercultural, right? Perhaps have a one-income family, which in this culture is more and more and more difficult, right? And that there are, when we are worried about family values and the divorce rate, and a lot of that is driven by the increasing structure of economic demands on families. Two-job couples, what do you call these, right? Two-income households, which sometimes is a good thing, but it has certain kinds of pressures attached to it that we don't get behind to understand what's putting pressure on the unitive side as well. So we just lift that up. You can discuss this at your tables as well. We'll move on to a second question. Ecological injustices were mentioned. Flint was mentioned. Charlie mentioned something that spurred this. I am not familiar with an African-American Catholic perspective on Humana Vitae. Has this question been analyzed from the perspective of race? And that's just a question I don't know the answer to.
I do know one pro-life social justice, Black Lives Matter activist and doula who has been working in Texas. Her name is Cecily Smith, and I highly recommend her work because she looks at how economic, ecological injustice and racial injustice end up affecting the lives of mothers and babies, and how there's a much higher rate of maternal death and infant death in African American communities. And she does a wonderful job of laying out why all of this happens. And unfortunately, there's a tendency among some pro-lifers only to bring up the race issue in order to say that there are more abortions happening in Black communities, therefore pro-choicers are eugenic people who are targeting these communities, instead of, again, as has been reiterated, looking at why these women might seek abortions. And actually, many of them really don't want to. What Cecily Smith emphasized was that this is a culture in which motherhood is valued and care of women by other women is valued. So this is not an issue of pressure from the sinister pro-choice forces, nor is it an issue of people being irresponsible and uncaring, which unfortunately I saw implied in an article, I think it was in Crisis, that, look at these African American women choosing abortions, isn't this dreadful? Instead, there is systemic and structural racial injustice that makes it much harder for women who are responsible, loving, hardworking, and caring to choose life in the way that they actually want to.
I don't have data ready to hand on this, but part of what I was going to say in my remarks I never got a chance to say was to highlight the movement of some very privileged people who are increasingly trying to move away from hormonal contraception as their way of trying to space births or separate sex from procreation in some ways. And it's not right-wing Catholics or something like this. Increasingly, it's more secular people. The website Quartz just had an article maybe last month or so detailing some of these stories that are especially alive on social media and Instagram and other places. And the article called it the pro-kale anti-hormone movement, which I think is pretty revealing. But tellingly, this can be contrasted with increasing attempts on the part of physicians, especially those that deal with vulnerable minority populations, to simply try to give them long-acting contraception with very high levels of hormones, even higher than the pill, and just say, deal with that for 2 decades, that's your deal, because reasons. So I think there's a question of racial justice there, when we have rich, white, religious or secular people saying, I'm kind of done with hormones. There's a lot of data to show this has a deleterious effect on many different kinds of people, including depression and sometimes suicide. European studies have shown the connection in many important ways. It's time to get off this, and they have the resources to do it, often related to reasons of racial injustice. But then again, for people of different means, and especially for racial minority communities, we often just kind of punt and say, there's your IUD, you know?
All right, one last question, and then we'll go to our table discussions. So all 3 of you mentioned dialogue, and named it as a pro-life and social justice practice, which I thought was great, right? Just to call it that. But I ask my students this frequently. Where is it possible for that kind of dialogue to happen in the actual culture we live in? I mean, I'm looking for places. The closest I can get is the classroom for 15 weeks. But that costs a lot of money, and most people aren't in that space. And I'm kind of at a loss for where else it is actually happening. I can think of some places that might be able to happen, but wisdom for the group. I don't know that Twitter is quite the right place. Oh, sorry, Charlie.
Oh, can I take this opportunity to invite you all to a place where dialogue will happen? I work with an organization called Revolution of Tenderness, and our director, unlike me, is non-combative, caring, and affectionate, and she's been a wonderful influence on me. But we have events called Festival of Friendship in Pittsburgh. It'll be late September. And one thing that we emphasize there is that it is kind of a not non-political in the classical sense, but non-political in the beat you over the head sense. It's a space where we have art, we have dialogue, we have information on human trafficking, immigration, poetry readings, and you know, this is just one tiny space of experience, but it's free to the public. And so, you know, it's unlike the classroom, anyone can walk in, and it would be lovely if all cities across the United States were to have events like this.
Right, but so you're having to create a space
Yes.
for that to happen, right? Because it's otherwise not,
Yeah.
it's hard to find it.
Yes.
I mean, I think it's a great question. I do think that there's a hunger for those kinds of conversations. And as much as people are worried about, especially discussing the abortion issue, there is increasingly a hunger for talking across these lines of division. And so I guess I would challenge those of us in the room who are educators or of some kind and do have these skills in moderating conversations to figure out how we might be able to move into other spaces and encourage a different level of conversation, whether that's bars or cafes or online spaces or whatever it is. And also to think of part of our mission as training our students to have those kinds of skills so that they can be people who can lead those conversations in whatever spaces they end up in.
I would second everything that's been said, and also say that the classroom is a very important place for this. But let me also offer a semi-hopeful remark about our national politics. So I'm a board member of Democrats for Life and have been part of some of our lobbying attempts to get precisely these kinds of crossover bills or legislative proposals passed or at least considered. And what I've learned is that lots and lots of individual legislators and their staffs are very interested in it. But when it comes time to make it public or to do some public work on it, interest groups rear their ugly head and don't allow, in fact, them to, they'll say, we just gave you all this money to get you elected. We're going to primary you if you do anything like this. So even though in their hearts, they're very much open to that, many, if not most of them, feel like their hands are tied because money and because resources. So I'm not saying anything new here, but until we have some kind of serious campaign finance reform and stopping thinking of money as speech in a strict sense, it's going to be very difficult. But if we were able to pull something like that off, I think I know a lot of legislators would feel more open to a pro-life social justice intersection.
You did say something new, because I just learned you can use primary as a verb. I did not know that. But y'all didn't come back, you had said this in your talk, which is what prompted my question. We didn't talk about parishes. We didn't talk about Catholic parishes being places where real dialogue can happen. And it seems to me that that is an infrastructure that's sitting there waiting to be utilized. How many Catholic parishes are there in the United States? They don't even have to be Catholic. But we don't think of that as a place of dialogue where people can sustain a dialogue over time. And what does that say about our ecclesiology in light of the fact we're talking about Humanae Vitae?
I'll just say something quickly about that.
Sure.
Not just in parishes, but in dioceses, in part due to financial shortfalls, but I think also due to what Julie called the growing hunger for this. Pro-life and say human concerns or social justice offices are in some places are being combined,
Yeah.
right? And so that's another, just to piggyback on what you just said, that's another hopeful place, I think, to focus.
Right. Oh, good. So he's ended on a note of hope. Now, where are we at? Oh, good. We would like you all, spurred by this, to spend about, we were going to say 20, but we'll get 17 minutes discussing what was raised in the comments and or what you see as the legacy of Humanae Vitae, maybe over the next 25 years. We don't have to look 50 years out. And or what it means to be pro-life today. So, what do you call this, Mike? It's not see one, do one, teach one. It's pair, care, and share, or something like that. So we'll be back in 17 minutes, and we'll hear some of your thoughts.